Today we're going to be looking at how science and religion might be agreeing to something, and that's about alcohol. Now, obviously, we all know science is a very important tool where we rationalize and we, study empiricism and find out new ways to gain more knowledge. But at the same time, we also need to find knowledge and wisdom in religions that deal with the human psyche and the things that give us meaning into life and things like that. So it's not always that you find these two things marry and tell a tale or a story about certain things. And today we're going to look at how alcohol is going to be part of that agreement. But before we move on, please hit subscribe or the notification bell. This would really help me out. So, without further ado, let's talk about the science and religion of alcohol. So it started out with me as a Malaysian, Southeast Asian with, I'm born and bred. I've got this Asian culture within me, and it's very different compared to the Western ones, right? Where the Westerners think critically more and they question things a lot. But then they also get into really weird deep shit like, this whole transgender stuff. Oh my God, it's really... So Asian culture, we're a bit more social. We are more in tune with relationships, but then again, we're also just following what everyone else is doing, so we don't question it too much. So I went to Germany, and in Germany, two things happened to me which sort of opened up my horizon. The number one thing was, well, I'm in a completely new country, right? I'm not living with my parents. There's no one watching over me. I can do whatever the hell I want. The second thing is that Germans have this weird drinking culture. It's such a difficult thing to intermingle with these people without immersing and trying out their alcohol, which is great. I mean, the beers in Germany is the best so far that I've tasted, but I mean, let's be honest, nobody drinks beer the first time and thinks, oh my God, this is like the best thing ever. Nobody does that, right? So, okay, so these are the two things that propelled me to the idea of, well, look, I never drank for like 17 years, and then suddenly like, okay, there's a chance for me to drink, so I did. Because one of the things that, alcohol was not prohibited for us from the get-go. There were like a few verses around the Quran which sort of brought us there. When you're drunk, you cannot really pray. I did not know what that meant. I'm a bit of an experimentalist myself, so I went down and tried it. So what happened was I just drank the hell out that one night, came back home at 5 a.m. in the morning, and I did the prayers. And there was this one position that I stayed in, which is almost like a child's pose, where you have the head and your palms on the floor and your butt sticking out in the air. Yeah, I stayed like that until like 10, 11 a.m. Weirdly enough, with like drool coming out of my mouth. That was the most, and weirdly, very satisfying sleep. Well, not really, but I don't remember too much about it. So some Germans are very adamant about their alcohol. They are very strict and saying things like, our law says that drinking is correct. That's why it's okay. That's why it's safe. So I consider alcohol as a drug, but when you try other drugs and tell them, oh, actually weed's not bad as well, they'll be like, no, that's haram. That's illegal because it's not part of the German law. Well, these are the people we call Stockemash, which basically means you have a stick up your ass, right? Let's try to find out what's the differences between, is alcohol a drug? Is alcohol not a drug? I'm not really too sure. One of the things that propelled me to question these things, is rekindled my obsession with this a little bit, is because of this video from Russell Brand. So Russell Brand is a brilliant actor from Man of the Greek, and he was very fond with the ladies, but he was a very well-known drug addict. He's one of the few celebrities who's gone past his fame of 27 years old. 27 years old is a very critical number, because that's the number where you realize, like, you know what, I've experienced most of my 20s. What is more to life? And some people who cannot handle the existential problem end up killing themselves. If you don't believe me, just look at Amy Winehouse, Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix. All these people cannot handle the existential crisis, but Russell Brand did. He turned around and fought his drug recovery, and he talked some truth. Let's look at this video.
By regarding addiction as an illness, by offering treatment instead of a more punitive approach, we can prevent people from committing crimes. Just personally, I was a criminal when I was a drug addict by virtue of my addiction and the ways that I had to acquire money to get drugs. Anecdotally, Chip was an armed robber in and out of Nick all the time. I hope you don't mind me telling them this. And other people I've met, criminality is a necessary component. Now, of course, we're not saying forget the victims, but I'm saying it's better to address the social situation pragmatically. And I think we all know this. By prescribing methadone to people, most people on methadone are using illegal drugs to supplement their habit. They're not addressing the root problems. We need to approach the victims with respect. Where there has been criminal behaviour, it needs to be dealt with correctly. But perhaps within the penal system itself, we can offer treatment to addicts, like the brilliant work that's done by RACT in various institutions and prisons.
So he talks about how, we should be compassionate. And what he means by compassionate is that we should be talking truthfully about the goods and the bads of each drug. I don't understand why there's a distinction between this, even in the language, right? We say we drink, or he drunk too much, he's hung over, as compared to, he got high out of his mind, or he was overdosed, like as if it's two distinct things when it's actually the same thing, right? The statistics, the science shows that a lot of deaths caused by alcohol, whereas if you see things like THC or marijuana, not that much, probably about close to zero. So this propelled me in that time to think about, okay, you know what, there's this guy that I follow. His name is David Nutt. And David Nutt is the former chief advisory for a drug committee for the government in UK. He got fired. And his job was to basically look at all the types of drugs in the world and classify 16 different categories of risks. So risks to yourself, risks to, or harm to yourself, harm to others, harm to your physical harm, emotional harm, all these things jumbled up together. And the number one drug that goes up on top of that list, drum roll please, is alcohol. And when he promotes this idea to the government goes like, I'm sorry, sir, this is not acceptable. Where's the heroin? The heroin's not here. You're wrong. You are fired. Why is it that suddenly you're rejecting science when the science are telling you the harms of a drug like alcohol, and they're giving an immediate solution to things that are causing a lot of problems in the families, breaking up relationships, you're harming yourself, you're harming society, and somehow, but we love beer, so we don't want that solution. But what we do want is a complete Green New Deal, so that we completely solve the climate problem, which the solution is only visible in the next 100 years for my great-grandchild. They can see the solutions. It's not just in the UK. There's also a clinical psychologist named B Peterson in Canada.
Much of my early work deals with alcoholism, yes, and at the biological level. That's what I did my PhD thesis on, and much of my early published papers, where I learned about brain function, because alcohol affects every part of the brain, so I had to learn a lot about the brain. One was that the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, NIAAA, which funded grant research in the United States, essentially made the kind of research I was doing with Robert Peel impossible. And it's part of the consequence. I think this is one of the things that the universities are doing so terribly wrong, is the ethics committees made our research impossible both to fund and to implement. So here's why. So we were bringing people into the lab. So here's who we picked for subjects. If you were going to be a subject in one of our experiments, you had to be a young man, and you had to have an alcoholic father and an alcoholic grandfather, and at least one other first or second degree male alcoholic relative. We would get these subjects. I mentioned who they were. They were young men who weren't alcoholic, but who drank socially, who had an alcoholic father, an alcoholic grandfather, and at least one other male alcoholic relative. Now, why did we pick subjects like that? Well, we knew alcoholism ran in families, and we couldn't really study its transmission in women, because if you're a female alcoholic and you drink when you have a child in utero, then the child can have fetal alcohol syndrome, and whatever abnormalities in psychophysiological response or psychopathologies might be associated with their alcoholism can easily be masked by the presence of fetal alcohol syndrome. So we couldn't use women. And besides, alcoholism is a problem that fundamentally characterizes men, although there are female alcoholics. I think it's 4-to-1, if I remember correctly from those days. It's 4-to-1 male to female. So it was, when we thought if we concentrated on those who had the highest probability of developing alcoholism because of their loaded family history, that we could shed some light on the mechanisms associated with alcoholism, and that would be useful for men and for women. So we studied sons of male alcoholics, sons of multi-generational male alcoholics. Those were our target group.
So when Jordan Peterson did his PhD in study in alcoholism, he found out that there are many constraints and restrictions about alcohol, which may be right? We don't want to get... It's a really difficult matter. We're not dealing with just samples, inanimate objects, but we're dealing with human beings. So they got them drunk, and then they have to get them sober, and that takes like 8 hours in the lab. And, it's really difficult to deal with drunk people. That's a really hard thing to do. But what's even worse from this whole fiasco is that the ethics committee wanted gender equality. Now, as you know, the prerequisite for this study is that you had to have males. And then on top of that, they say, well, that's not fair. I know your hypothesis is for males, but we have to include females in there. And while you're at it, add on the Black Americans or the Hispanics or the Latins, and put some Asians in there as well. You have to have a quota of every single group that you want to put in there. So the sciences are showing that alcohol is not a good thing. Celebrities are also... There's another celebrity, Joe Rogan, right? He's definitely the most famous podcaster in the whole world. He has talked to many, many people who has problems with alcohol recovery. He knows the ins and outs about what the dangers of alcohol is, and here's what he has to say.
Like alcohol. If alcohol was fully illegal and you just get it from mafia guys, 14-year-olds would have the same access as 34-year-olds.
That's a very good point. That's probably the best point for it.
Yeah.
Because
now
kids
they got to find some cool 22-year-old.
Yeah.
That's the only way they can get it.
That 22-year-old's taking a big chance these days.
Taking a
think
chance.
That shit's a giant felony.
Really?
Yeah. When we were kids, it wasn't nothing.
Or fake ID, or stealing from your dad.
Always sold booze. You would wait outside a liquor store and a guy would buy booze for you. You tell him you give him $20, they didn't give a fuck.
$20 surcharge, then the price of the whatever.
Yeah, just tell the guy we'll give you $20 if you go and get us a fucking
We may or may not have used the
case.
drive-thrus, and they'd just give it to us when we were 17, 18 years old.
Yeah, they didn't give a fuck.
Wow.
They didn't, especially in Ohio. They're trying to get you drunk so you stay.
Yeah, exactly. Get somebody pregnant. We can't lose you.
Yeah,
we can't lose another.
we need to keep you around, son. If getting you drunk is how we do it. Yeah, it's weird that we have this one drug we give a pass to.
Yeah.
And it's the one that's the most destructive to your health. It's fucking bananas. It really is.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And this is not just celebrities or science, right? The science is there, the celebrities are also showing the same thing. Now, okay, let's go on to maybe there's something more. Let's look at religion a little bit, right? So one of the persons that I sort of follow, and he explains things, Islamic teachings in a sort of a good way, Hamza Yusuf, although I don't really agree with a lot of his... with some of his stuff, right? But he's still a brilliant person. And here's what he has to say about alcohol.
This is the reality. If you allow all this filth to come in, then it's going to come out. A vessel can only pour forth what it contains. So if you fill the vessel up with filth, and then it pours forth filth, why are you surprised? And the CDC just did a study, 1 out of 10 people in America die direct result of alcohol. Suppressed study. They didn't even put it in the major newspapers. 1 out of 10. Decimation, to decimate means to kill 1 out of 10. That's the original meaning of that term, decimate, right? To take 1 out of 10. You decimate a people. So here's a filth, the al-khaba'ith, the mother, the matrix of foulness, is killing 1 out of 10 people, and there's no war on alcohol. There's a war on marijuana, right? Marijuana's not killing 1 out of 10 people. It's probably doing a lot to calm Americans down because they're so riled up, right?
So he's right. Like, if you put in the filth in your body, you spew out filth out of your body. And even he himself would say, like, you know what? There's a war on marijuana, but there's no war on alcohol. Like, why is that? Even though alcohol is the more dangerous drug, that doesn't click. So I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just human beings trying to find an escape. They're trying to find a space where they can be, where they sedate it out of their mind, literally, to stop thinking about whatever it is that happened. That does not help any relationship, now does it? Let's say if you have a real big problem with your wife or your spouse, and then instead of dealing with the problem up front, although it's really, really hard, you decided to, let's just drink it up, forget about it, and then the next day you just say, what? I don't remember about last night. Who's to say whether you really remembered or you really didn't, right? It's sort of like an escape for you, like a substitute for you to run away from your responsibilities. Now, this whole idea that you're literally sedating your mind is not an odd concept. Let's go back to the science. The neuroscientist, Matthew Walker, he's a sleep scientist, and he says from his studies that if you sleep between 7 to 9 hours consistently every day, you are at a lower risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. And the reason for that is because your brain is sort of, think about your brain as New York City, right? And at nighttime, when everyone goes to sleep, it needs to refresh itself. There's a lot of gutter, there's a lot of trash in the gutter and trash everywhere, and it needs to be cleaned out. And these things are cleaned out during deep REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep. And if you do not get enough of that sleep, you most likely will have problems with dementia and memories and things like that later on in your life. His idea with alcohol is this: when you are drinking alcohol, you are sedated. You are not sleeping naturally. So all those cleaning does not work. So he did this memory study. You're supposed to be looking at a manual, and then you memorize everything on that manual, and then in 4 days you have to do all those tasks on those manuals, right? So you had 3 different groups. The first group basically is a control group. They didn't drink anything at all. And obviously on the 4th day at night when they did it, their memory retention was perfect. And the second group, well, they drank every night until that night that they were tested. And, well, obviously they only retained like 30% or 40%, something like this. It was ridiculously low. Now, but the interesting part is that there's another last group, and the last group is only drank one night, the night before the test, and even they only retained 40% of the information. I'm not trying to advocate here that you should be drinking every day. No, the idea is that the effects of alcohol is so bad that, one tiny slip of it is already enough for you to lose your memory, especially when it interferes with your sleep.
I mean, alcohol is probably one of the most both misunderstood and most sort of abused sleep aids, and it obviously is not an aid at all. It's actually remarkably detrimental to sleep. But
it's
yeah,
a tricky one because
is...
it feels like a short-term fix, as it can kind of get you into the sleep state, but it's not a good sleep.
That's what people think. You mistake sedation for sleep. Alcohol is a class of drugs that we call the sedatives, and sedation isn't sleep. It's very different. Now, when you drink heavily and you sort of, you fall asleep, I'm not going to argue that you're awake. You're clearly not awake. But to say that you've gone into naturalistic sleep is an equal falsehood. You simply have sedated your cortex.
So it's not often that I get to have a summary of science and religion, just combining it with together, agreeing in some ways. Now, obviously, I only talked about religion from the religious aspect only from Hamza Yusuf, but Jordan Peterson is basically, most of his work is predicated upon the bedrock of Christianity. It's basically supported with the Bible and underneath it. Or you can check out his immense 500-hour videos on significance of the Bibles. But it's not easy to find these moments where you have science and religion marry each other and then agree on a subject, but somehow we're still rejecting it, and we shouldn't do that. Let's stop drinking alcohol.